I pulled together a few slides from Chapter 6 where the discussion is about the government trying to control prices and also levying taxes and how that affects the market, because it does indeed affect the market. And one way, as it points out in this slide, is by price controls. There are times when the government fixes the price of something, says it cannot be any higher than this much, or it can't be any lower than a certain amount. Okay. Uh, and when they do, they put a burden on the market. Okay, so we're moving away from a free market when we do that, and it will cause issues either with buyers and sellers or both. All right, and then the other reason the government does intervene in a market is they need to raise taxes. So they do it by putting a tax on products, and that's something we all have to live with if we want a government that protects us and does all that the government does. All right, so one of the examples in the book, and there are more that you can go through, here they're showing a price ceiling that is not binding on the market. What it means is that the price ceiling is way higher than what the equilibrium is for the market. So therefore, there's nothing binding on the market. There's no penalty. All right, but over here on the right side, we do have a problem. The price ceiling is set at $2, where the equilibrium market is $3. And that means sellers will want to produce here at that price. Buyers want to buy there at that price, and there is a surplus. Okay, so the market is not acting efficiently there. Next one is the minimum wage. Now, the wage is the price of in the labor market. Okay, so you can look at wages as prices, and so therefore they have a market also. All right, so in the case of the government raising the minimum wage, what they'll do is create unemployment. So here, the equilibrium, the government puts a minimum wage higher than where the equilibrium is. And for example, in the state where I lived, minimum wage, I think, is about $8.15 an hour. If the government came along and said it's going to be $12 an hour, that would be the problem right there. The minimum wage would be down here at 8. The new government mandated minimum wage is at 12. You're going to have a whole lot of people that come out of their houses and want to go get jobs now to make $12 an hour, where they didn't want to work for 8. And the problem is you have suppliers who don't want to supply at that price, and you end up with this labor surplus. You end up with unemployment. Okay, so most economists would agree that when a minimum wage is increased above its current market level, you're going to create unemployment. All right. Another thing that governments sometimes do is they want to use price controls because of the unfair market outcome they see, and they try to fix it, mainly trying to help the poor, but they often hurt those that they're trying to help. And another way that economists would recommend is if you don't like the fact that the rents are going up higher than the people in the lower income brackets can afford, don't try to put rent controls in. That's a terrible thing to do for the market. You end up hurting the very people you're trying to help. If you want to help them, you could give them rent subsidies, give them extra money to apply towards their rent. And the same thing with the unemployment. Instead of putting a required minimum wage, increasing it or whatever, if there's a community that you feel is not being paid well enough, then you can give them subsidies, wage subsidies, usually through a tax reduction. Okay. Now, another thing that we can look at is what happens when you do put a tax on a market. Okay, you create what's called a tax wedge. The wedge in this case would be this little triangle right here. Okay, the equilibrium without taxes on this market would be right here. If you put a tax on the market, if you say there's going to be a tax, here they said they're going to put it on sellers, and it ends up being this way. And that tax is actually shared when you look at the way the market works. Okay, so you can start off saying I'm going to put this tax on the sellers, but that's not where the burden goes. The burden is determined by the market and not by what the government politician wanted to do. If he says he wants the burden to be shared equally between buyers and sellers, he can set it up that way if he wants, but the market actually determines who pays the burden. All right. So another one that I saw that we should look at is down here. This is how the burden of a tax is divided. Now, these are all coming right out of your tax figure 9. So in this case, we have a situation where we have an elastic supply, fairly elastic, but we have an inelastic demand. You can see the demand curve is very vertical. The more vertical the demand curve is, the more inelastic that is. All right, so what happens is you may have the intention of the tax being shared 50-50, but if you have an industry where the elasticity of demand is very inelastic, the burden will be shared more by the seller, that's that portion from there to there, than it will be by the buyer, which is this portion from here to here. Okay, so you can say you want it to be a 50-50 tax sharing, but it won't work out that way if there's differences in the inelastics. Okay, so basically the lesson learned here is that the tax burden falls more heavily on the side of the market that is less elastic. And there's a small elasticity of demand. Buyers do not have good alternatives for consuming this good. And if there's a small elasticity of supply, then the sellers do not have good alternatives to producing the good. All right. And one more thing I wanted to look at was, now in the news lately, we know that we just passed a corporate tax reduction. The corporate tax has been dropped from 35% down to 21%. So that is an improvement in the market. The tax wedge has been reduced. Okay, so for example, if this were the 25% level, I'm sorry, the 35% level, that would be here. That big triangle I'm tracing right now is the tax wedge. It's the loss in the efficiency of the market. So in that case there, and I have here elasticity of supply and elasticity of demand are pretty much equal, okay, in their slopes. So in this case, the burden is being borne by about 50-50. The sellers pay half the tax and the buyers pay half the tax. But with this new corporate tax reduction, what is going to happen? We are going to shrink the tax wedge. We're going to go to this new level in here. All right, so the buyers will get a price reduction and the sellers will get a price increase. All right, still not where it would be at the market. If the tax were not enacted at all, what the buyers would pay and what the sellers would receive is smallest. All right, but because we have to raise money for the government, we put taxes on corporations. Okay, so that tax reduction that we just heard about in the news should be a very positive thing for us because it's going to shift the tax wedge over, make it smaller, make that market work more efficiently. Buyers should get price reductions, sellers should get improvements. And all of it depends on the type of market that you're in. If you're in a market for insulin, which is a very highly inelastic demand, then the benefit of the tax reduction, corporate tax reduction, will not be shared equally by buyer and seller. On the other hand, if it's the car market where the demand is usually very elastic, more horizontal, then there should be an equal sharing between the buyers and the sellers of that. So we should see a price reduction on the purchase of a car, for example. Okay, so I hope that helps. Give me any questions you have, either on the forum or come to my email. Thanks.